What if everything you were taught about human history was incomplete? What if there was a book older than the Bible that told a different story? A story of angels who fell from grace, of giants who walked the earth, of forbidden knowledge passed from heaven to humanity. A story so dangerous it was banned for over 1,000 years. Tonight, I want to show you that book, and by the end, you'll understand why they tried to erase it. This is the Book of Enoch, and it might hold humanity's true history. Long before the Bible was finalized, before councils of men in robes decided which books were holy and which were dangerous, this text existed. It was read by early Christians, quoted by apostles, studied by church fathers, and then, suddenly, deliberately, it vanished. Removed from the canon, erased from memory, hidden in a remote corner of the world where empires could not reach and councils could not condemn. For over 1,000 years, the world forgot it existed, until 1773, when a Scottish explorer brought 3 manuscripts back from Ethiopia, and the secrets began to surface again. You're standing in the highlands of Ethiopia, 13th century. The air is thin and cold, your breath visible in the mountain wind. Before you stands a monastery carved into the mountainside, its walls thick stone blackened by centuries of candle smoke. Inside, in a chamber lit only by oil lamps, monks in dark robes move silently between shelves of ancient manuscripts. These are not ordinary books. They are written on vellum made from the skin of goats. The ink is black as obsidian, and the script is Ge'ez, an ancient language that looks like art as much as writing. There, resting on a wooden lectern worn smooth by generations of hands, is a manuscript that the rest of the Christian world forgot. You step closer. Your footsteps echo on cold stone. You reach out with trembling fingers to touch the first page. The parchment is rough beneath your fingertips, stiff with age. As your eyes trace the opening lines, a chill runs down your spine. Because you're holding something the world was never supposed to see again. You're holding the Book of Enoch. The words begin simply. The words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the elect and righteous. Already, in that first sentence, you sense this is not ordinary theology. This is a book of secrets, of visions, of things witnessed by a man who, according to the Bible itself, never died. A man who walked with God and was taken. If you stay with me until the end, you will see the world differently. You'll understand why ancient civilizations seem to know things they shouldn't have known. Why the Antikythera mechanism, a 2,000-year-old analog computer, could predict eclipses with precision that wouldn't be matched for 1,000 years. Why the pyramids of Giza align perfectly with the constellation of Orion. Why myths from cultures separated by oceans tell the same stories of gods descending and giants walking the earth. You'll understand why there are reports, buried in old newspapers, of giant skeletons unearthed and then quietly removed from view. Bones that don't fit the timeline we've been taught. And you'll begin to ask the question that terrifies institutions more than any other. What if the Book of Enoch wasn't banned because it was false? What if it was banned because it was too true? Because it revealed something about the origin of evil, the nature of angels, the source of forbidden knowledge, that those in power decided we were better off not knowing. If you're listening right now, wherever you are, leave a comment and tell me your time zone. Tell me where you are in the world. I want to know, does the lamplight where you sit glow the same way it once fell across these ancient pages in a monastery where truth was preserved, not because it was safe, but because it was forgotten? The Book of Enoch is divided into 5 sections. The Book of the Watchers, which tells of fallen angels. The Book of Parables, which describes a Messiah 200 years before Christ. The Astronomical Book, which contains knowledge ancient people shouldn't have possessed. The Book of Dreams, which retells history through prophecy. and the Epistle, which divides time into 10 weeks, and the final 3 may be unfolding right now. So let's begin. Let's walk together into the Forbidden Chronicle and see what Enoch saw when he walked with God. Chapter 1. The Man Who Walked with God. You're reading Genesis chapter 5 on a quiet evening, the pages thin and worn beneath your fingers. The genealogies march down the page in predictable rhythm. Adam lived 930 years, had sons and daughters, and then he died. Seth lived 912 years, had sons and daughters, and then he died. Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, each entry follows the same pattern. Birth and life and death, the drumbeat of mortality echoing through every generation. A reminder that dust returns to dust, that the curse in the garden spread to every descendant of Adam. And as you read, your eyes begin to glaze over because these genealogies feel distant, abstract, just names and numbers from a world so far removed from yours that they hardly seem real. But then you reach verse 21, and something changes. You're in the 7th generation now, Jared's son, and his name is Enoch. And Enoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. Normal so far, the pattern holding. But then verse 23 says he lived 365 years, which is strange because it's so much shorter than the others. Jared lived 962 years, Methuselah would live 969. So why does Enoch's life seem cut short? And then you reach verse 24, and your finger stops on the page because the words are different. The pattern breaks. Instead of, "and he died," the text says something else, something that has puzzled readers for thousands of years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Your eyes linger on those 9 words. He walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No death, no burial, no mourning, just an absence, a taking, as if the boundary between earth and heaven became thin enough for one man to cross while still breathing, and you sit back in your chair, the lamplight casting shadows across the page, and you wonder what that phrase really means. To walk with God. Because everyone else in the genealogy is described as living and begetting and dying. But Enoch walked, as if his life was fundamentally different, as if he moved through the world in a way no one else could. And then, at the end of his 365 years, the exact number of days in a solar year, as if his life itself was aligned with cosmic time, he was taken, not to death, but to something else, somewhere else. You close your eyes and try to imagine it. A man standing in a field, or on a mountain, or in the darkness before dawn, and suddenly the air around him changes, thickens, hums with presence, and he looks up and realizes he's no longer alone, that the boundary between the seen and unseen has dissolved, and in that moment, Enoch steps forward, or is lifted, or simply ceases to be in the place where he was, because God took him. And the question that follows you as you sit in the quiet of your evening is this: where did God take him? And what did Enoch see there that made him worthy of this singular fate? Because in the entire Hebrew Bible, only 2 people are said to have been taken without dying. Enoch is one. Elijah the prophet is the other, carried to heaven in a whirlwind centuries later. So what was it about Enoch that set him apart? What did he know? What did he witness? And why does the Bible give him only 4 verses, when his story clearly matters enough to break the pattern of every other life in Genesis? The genealogies of Genesis are not accidental. Every name, every number carries meaning. Adam means man, or earth. Seth means appointed, given to replace Abel. Enosh means mortal, or frail. And Enoch, his name means dedicated, or initiated. as if from birth he was set apart for something. And when the text says he walked with God, the Hebrew phrase is halak et ha-Elohim, which doesn't just mean casual companionship. It implies an ongoing, intimate relationship, the kind of walking that happens over time, day after day, year after year. For 365 years, Enoch walked with God. And at the end of that walk, he was taken, as if the journey led somewhere, as if walking with God long enough eventually means you cross over into the place where God dwells. But here's what makes this even more intriguing. Enoch is the seventh generation from Adam. In biblical numerology, 7 is the number of completion, of divine perfection. The seventh day is rest, the seventh year is Sabbath. And here in the seventh generation stands a man who completes the pattern by transcending death. Some scholars see this as symbolic, others see it as literal. But what both groups agree on is that Enoch occupies a unique position in the narrative. He is a bridge figure, someone who connects the world before the flood with the world after, someone who witnessed the corruption that led to the deluge and carried that knowledge forward, not through death and descendants alone, but through direct experience. Because if God took him, if he entered the heavenly realms while still alive, then Enoch became something more than a man. He became a witness to divine secrets, a scribe of heaven, a keeper of knowledge that no one else possessed. The Bible doesn't tell us what happened to Enoch after he was taken. Genesis simply moves on. Methuselah, Enoch's son, lives 969 years, the longest lifespan recorded in Scripture. And his name, according to some interpretations, means, "When he dies, it shall come." A prophecy embedded in a name. And indeed, the year Methuselah dies is the year the flood comes, as if his life was a countdown, a grace period given to humanity before judgment fell. Methuselah becomes the father of Lamech, and Lamech becomes the father of Noah, and through Noah's line, humanity survives the flood. But Enoch, taken before the corruption reached its peak, before the Nephilim walked the earth in great numbers, before the violence became so severe that God regretted making man, Enoch was removed, preserved, hidden away in a place where the coming judgment could not touch him. And this is where the story gets complicated, because for thousands of years, Jewish and Christian readers looked at those 4 verses in Genesis and asked the same question you're asking now. What happened to Enoch? Where did he go? What did he see? And why, if his experience was significant enough to be mentioned in Scripture, why don't we have more information? Why is his story so brief, so frustratingly incomplete? The answer, it turns out, is that we do have more information. We have an entire book, written in Enoch's name, claiming to record the visions and journeys he experienced after God took him. The Book of Enoch, the text that was banned, the manuscript that survived in Ethiopia. And when you read that book, when you see what it claims Enoch witnessed, you begin to understand why the Bible's silence might have been intentional. Because what Enoch saw, according to the text that bears his name, was not comforting. It was not safe. It was a vision of rebellion and corruption that began not on earth, but in heaven, with angels who looked down at humanity and desired what they should not have desired. In Jewish tradition, especially in the mystical writings that emerged centuries after Genesis was written, Enoch's role expanded dramatically. He was no longer just a man who walked with God. He became Metatron, the highest of the Archangels, the one who sits on a throne beside the throne of God, the one who serves as the scribe of heaven, recording every deed, every thought, every prayer that rises from the earth. In the third book of Enoch, a medieval Hebrew text steeped in mysticism, Enoch describes his transformation, how his flesh became flame, how his body expanded to fill the cosmos, how he was given 70 names and seated in the seventh heaven, second only to the divine presence itself. This is not the humble man of Genesis. This is Enoch transfigured, elevated, made into something angelic. And the question this raises, the question that theologians have debated for centuries, is whether this transformation was literal or symbolic, whether Enoch really did become an angel, or whether the later mystical traditions were using his story as a metaphor for spiritual ascent. In Islamic tradition, Enoch appears as Idris, a prophet mentioned twice in the Quran. Surah Maryam says, "And mention in the book Idris. Indeed, he was a man of truth and a prophet, and we raised him to a high station." The tradition holds that Idris was taken to the fourth heaven, that he taught humanity writing and astronomy, that he was the first to use the pen, the first to study the movements of the stars. Some scholars see this as evidence that knowledge of Enoch's story spread far beyond Jewish and Christian communities, that his reputation as a wise man, a seer, a bridge between heaven and earth, was recognized across cultures and religions. Others argue that the Quranic Idris and the biblical Enoch are separate figures who later became conflated. But what both traditions share is the idea that this man, whoever he was, possessed knowledge that others did not, that he had access to divine wisdom, that he saw things hidden from ordinary mortals. And in early Christian writings, Enoch takes on yet another role. The Epistle of Jude, a short letter near the end of the New Testament, quotes directly from the Book of Enoch. Jude 1:14-15 says, "Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly." This is not a vague reference. This is a direct quotation, word for word, from the first book of Enoch, and the fact that Jude quotes it as prophecy, attributing the words to Enoch by name, suggests that the early Christian community, or at least the community Jude was writing to, viewed the Book of Enoch as authoritative, as inspired, as scripture. Church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen all reference the Book of Enoch in their writings. Some quote it approvingly, others express caution. But the fact that they engage with it at all shows that the text was known, debated, and influential in the first few centuries of Christianity. So why, if Enoch's book was so widely read, so deeply respected, did it eventually disappear? Why did the councils of the 4th and 5th centuries, when they formalized the biblical canon, leave it out? The standard answer is that it's pseudepigraphal, falsely attributed, not actually written by Enoch, but by unknown authors centuries later who used his name to give their work authority. And scholars agree. The Book of Enoch, as we have it, was likely compiled between 300 and 100 BC, long after Enoch's time, by Jewish writers working in the apocalyptic tradition. But here's the problem with dismissing it on those grounds. Many books in the Bible are also pseudepigraphal. The Book of Daniel, for example, was likely written in the 2nd century BC, but presents itself as the work of a man living in the 6th century BC. The pastoral epistles attributed to Paul were probably written by later disciples. The Book of Hebrews has no known author, and yet these texts made it into the canon because the communities that used them found them spiritually valuable, theologically sound, consistent with the broader scriptural narrative. The Book of Enoch, however, was not consistent. It was strange. It was unsettling. It claimed that angels had physical bodies, that they could reproduce with humans, that the giants born from those unions were not just large humans, but something else, something monstrous. And it placed the origin of evil not in the garden with Adam and Eve, but in heaven with rebellious angels who descended to earth and corrupted creation. This was too much for later theologians. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential church fathers, argued in the early 5th century that angels are purely spiritual beings, that they cannot take physical form, that the sons of God in Genesis 6 must refer to the righteous line of Seth, not to angels. His interpretation became the dominant view in Western Christianity, And once that view solidified, the Book of Enoch, with its explicit account of angelic rebellion and hybridization, became an embarrassment, a relic of an earlier, less refined theology. And so it was quietly removed, not officially banned, but simply not included, not copied, not read, until it faded from memory everywhere except Ethiopia. But what if Augustine was wrong? What if the early interpretation, the one held by Jewish writers before Christianity, the one quoted by Jude and referenced by early church fathers, what if that interpretation was closer to the truth? What if angels really did descend? What if the Nephilim were real? What if Enoch, the man who walked with God, witnessed this rebellion firsthand, saw the corruption spreading, and was taken before the flood specifically so he could record what happened, so that future generations would know the truth about where evil came from? If that's the case, then the Book of Enoch is not mythology. It's testimony.
And the 4 verses in Genesis, brief as they are not the full story. They're an invitation to look deeper, to ask more questions, to wonder what happened to the man who was taken. And when you follow that invitation, when you open the Book of Enoch and begin to read, you discover a world far stranger and more terrifying than anything the Bible explicitly describes. A world where the boundary between heaven and earth is not fixed, where beings of light can fall, where knowledge can corrupt, and where the consequences of rebellion echo through generations. Maybe the reason Enoch's story matters, the reason it was preserved even when it made people uncomfortable, is because it challenges the way we think about access to the divine. In most religious systems, there's a hierarchy. You have priests, temples, rituals, institutions that mediate between the human and the holy. But Enoch had none of that. He didn't perform sacrifices. He didn't build altars. He just walked. Day after day, year after year, he walked with God. And that simple, unmediated relationship was enough. It was enough for God to take him, to remove him from the cycle of death, to bring him into the heavenly realms and show him secrets that no one else saw. And maybe that's what made his story dangerous. Because if Enoch could walk with God without priests, without temples, without institutions, then so could anyone. The story suggests that the divine is not locked away behind ritual and hierarchy, that intimacy with God is not reserved for the elite or the ordained, that it's available to anyone willing to walk, to keep walking, to make that relationship the center of their life. This is a radical idea. It was radical in Enoch's time, and it's still radical now. Because institutions, whether religious or political, depend on control. They depend on being the gatekeepers. And Enoch's story says, you don't need a gatekeeper. You just need to walk. But the story also warns us that walking with God, seeing what he saw, comes with a cost. Enoch was removed from the world. He didn't get to grow old with his family. He didn't see his grandchildren. He was taken, lifted out of ordinary life, and whatever he saw in the heavenly realms, whatever knowledge he gained, it set him apart forever. The Book of Enoch describes visions of judgment, of angels in chains, of the spirits of the Nephilim wandering the earth as demons. These are not comforting images. They're warnings. And the question his story asks us is this: if you could walk with God, if you could see what Enoch saw, would you? Or would the weight of that knowledge, the isolation it brings, be too much to bear? Truth has a cost. Access to the divine has a cost, and Enoch paid it. But the question that follows you as you close Genesis and consider his 4 brief verses is this: what did Enoch see that made him willing to pay that price? What was so important, so urgent, that it had to be recorded, preserved, passed down through generations even when it meant defying councils and outlasting empires? The answer, we're about to discover, begins with angels, and what happens when they fall. Are you ready to meet the angels who fell? Because that's where we're going next. To Mount Hermon, northern Israel,
9,200 feet above sea level, where 200 angels descended and made an oath that would change the course of human history. They called themselves the Watchers. They were sent to observe humanity, but observation turned to desire, and desire turned to rebellion. And from that rebellion came the Nephilim, giants born of forbidden unions, beings that should never have existed. And the violence they brought was so great, the corruption so complete, that God decided to cleanse the earth with water. This is the story the Book of Enoch tells in its first section, the Book of the Watchers. And it's the story that Genesis chapter 6 hints at in just 4 verses. But what Genesis compresses into a few lines, Enoch expands into a full narrative, with names, with details, with consequences that echo through time. We're about to step onto that mountain. We're about to hear the oath those angels made. We're about to see the knowledge they gave to humanity, forbidden knowledge, dangerous knowledge, the kind of knowledge that looks like progress but leads to destruction. And we're about to witness the judgment that followed, the binding of the fallen, the destruction of the giants, and the flood that reset creation. The path continues. The manuscript is still open, and Enoch, the man who walked with God, is waiting to show us what he saw. So, take a breath. Let the world outside fade a little more, and walk with me to the place where heaven and earth collided, where angels fell, and where the story of evil truly begins. Chapter 2. The Watchers, Angels Who Fell. You're standing on Mount Hermon, northern Israel, in a time before the flood, before cities rose and fell, before history as you know it began. The altitude is 9,200 feet. The air is thin and cold, sharp in your lungs with each breath. Snow covers the peak even in summer, and from where you stand you can see 3 countries, Israel to the south, Lebanon to the west, Syria to the east, borders that don't exist yet in the time you're imagining, because borders are human constructs, and you're here to witness something that predates humanity's attempts to divide the world. The wind cuts across the mountainside, carrying with it the scent of cedar and stone, and as you look up at the sky, vast and blue and impossibly deep, you feel small in a way that has nothing to do with your physical size, and everything to do with the realization that you're standing in a place where the boundary between earth and heaven once grew thin. This is the mountain where 200 angels descended. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. According to the Book of Enoch, they came here, to this specific place, and they bound themselves by oath, swearing to each other that they would go through with what they were about to do, that none of them would turn back, that they would share the guilt equally, so no single one could claim innocence later. They called themselves the Watchers. In Aramaic, the language of Enoch's text, the word is irin, which means those who are awake, or those who watch. And their original purpose was exactly that, to watch, to observe humanity from a distance, to report back to heaven on the progress of Adam's descendants, to bear witness without interfering, because interference, as any scientist knows, corrupts the experiment, changes the outcome, and whatever God intended for humanity, whatever slow unfolding of free will and choice and consequence was supposed to happen, the Watchers were meant to observe it, not alter it. But observation requires distance, and distance, when you're watching something beautiful, something desirable, becomes harder and harder to maintain. The Book of Enoch tells us that the Watchers looked down and saw the daughters of men. They saw their beauty, and they wanted them. Not the abstract wanting of appreciation, not the detached admiration of art, but the visceral, consuming desire that leads to action, to choice, to the crossing of boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. And so they descended, here, to this mountain. And under the leadership of an angel named Samyaza, they made their oath. "Let us all swear an oath," Samyaza said, according to the text, and bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. They knew it was wrong. They knew there would be consequences, but they swore anyway. And then they came down. You kneel on the cold stone and run your hand across the rock worn smooth by wind and time. Somewhere beneath your fingers, if the story is true, 200 angels stood in a circle and spoke words that would unleash chaos on the earth. You close your eyes and try to imagine it. The moment before the oath, the hesitation, and then the choice, the step forward, the descent, and everything that followed. The Book of the Watchers, the first section of 1st Enoch, gives us names. 20 leaders are listed, each one a watcher who descended, each one responsible for teaching humanity something it was not supposed to know. Samyaza is the first, the ringleader, the one who convinced the others to swear the oath because he knew that no single angel would have the courage to rebel alone, but together, bound by shared guilt, they could go through with it. Azazel is the second, and his name would become synonymous with the scapegoat, the one who bears the sins of others. But before he became a symbol, he was a teacher, and what he taught was metallurgy, the working of metals into weapons, swords and knives and spears and shields. And according to Enoch, before Azazel, humans fought with stones and sticks, with primitive tools. But after Azazel, they fought with bronze and iron, and war became organized, systematic, deadly, in ways it had never been before. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations and the signs. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. And on, each watcher sharing a piece of heavenly knowledge, skills and sciences that were meant to be revealed slowly, carefully, with guidance, but instead were given all at once, recklessly, to a humanity that was not ready, that did not have the wisdom to use them well. The text describes this as the fundamental sin of the Watchers, not just that they took human wives, not just that they produced offspring, but that they gave knowledge prematurely, that they disrupted the natural development of civilization, that they introduced technologies and ideas that humanity would have eventually discovered on its own, but was not yet mature enough to handle. And there's something deeply unsettling about this idea when you think about it in modern terms. We live in an age of rapid technological advancement, of knowledge doubling every few years, of artificial intelligence and genetic engineering and quantum computing. Technologies that give us godlike power without necessarily giving us the wisdom to use that power well. And the story of the Watchers asks a question that feels uncomfortably relevant. What happens when knowledge outpaces wisdom? When capability exceeds maturity? When we gain the ability to do things before we understand whether we should? The Watchers, according to Enoch, didn't just give humanity tools. They gave humanity tools that led to corruption, to violence, to the breakdown of the order that God had established. And the implication is that some knowledge, introduced at the wrong time, is not enlightenment, but poison. But the teaching was only part of the corruption. The other part, the part that Genesis chapter 6 hints at in its brief and cryptic verses, was the offspring. The Watchers took human wives, and from those unions, children were born. They were called the Nephilim in Hebrew, a word whose root means to fall, suggesting either that they were the children of the fallen, or that their very presence caused others to fall into sin and despair. In Greek translations, they're called the gigantes, giants, and Enoch describes them as enormous. Some accounts say 3,300 cubits tall, which if taken literally would make them nearly 5,000 feet. Obviously an exaggeration or a symbolic number. But even if we assume the text is using hyperbole to convey the idea of beings far larger and stronger than normal humans, the point remains. The Nephilim were not natural. They were hybrids, part angel and part human,
and their existence violated the boundaries God had set in creation. The Book of Enoch says the Nephilim consumed everything. At first, they ate what humans provided, the harvests, the livestock. But their appetites were too great, and soon they began to devour the resources meant for everyone else. And when those ran out, they turned on humanity itself, consuming people, drinking blood, and spreading terror. The violence became so extreme, the corruption so complete, that the earth itself cried out. The text says that the blood of the slain rose up to heaven, and the groaning of the oppressed reached the ears of the archangels, Michael and Gabriel and Raphael and Uriel, who brought the matter before God. And God's response was swift and absolute. The Nephilim could not be allowed to continue. The Watchers could not go unpunished. And humanity, corrupted by forbidden knowledge and terrorized by unnatural beings, could not be saved without a complete reset. Now, here's where the story intersects with Genesis in a way that's both illuminating and controversial. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4 says, "When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, 'My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown.'" 4 verses. That's all Genesis gives us. No explanation of who the sons of God are, no details about what the Nephilim did, no account of why their presence was a problem. Just a brief mention, and then the text moves immediately to God's decision to send the flood. For centuries, theologians have debated what these verses mean. The traditional Jewish interpretation, the one held before Augustine changed the Christian consensus, was that the sons of God were angels. The phrase, "sons of God," appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, most notably in Job, where it clearly refers to angelic beings who present themselves before the Lord. But in the 5th century, Augustine argued that this interpretation made angels too physical, too fallen, too much like pagan myths where gods mated with mortals. And he proposed instead that the sons of God were the righteous descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men were the corrupt descendants of Cain. So the sin was not angelic rebellion, but intermarriage between the faithful and the unfaithful. His interpretation became dominant in the Western Church, and for over 1,000 years, that's how Genesis 6 was read, as a warning against marrying outside the faith, not as an account of angelic human hybrids. But here's the problem with Augustine's interpretation. It doesn't explain the Nephilim. If the sons of God were just human descendants of Seth, why would their children be giants? Why would they be described as mighty men of renown? Why would their existence be significant enough to warrant mention right before the flood? The text seems to be saying that something unnatural happened, something that required divine intervention, and Enoch's account, with its detailed story of angelic descent and hybridization, provides an explanation that Augustine's interpretation does not. This is likely why the early church fathers, before Augustine, accepted the Book of Enoch and quoted it approvingly, because it made sense of Genesis 6 in a way that the later allegorical readings could not. There's also the matter of parallel myths. Cultures all over the world, cultures that had no contact with ancient Israel, tell stories that sound remarkably similar to what Enoch describes. In Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki are described as gods who descended from the heavens and interacted with humanity, sometimes taking human wives, sometimes teaching forbidden knowledge. Greek mythology is full of stories about gods mating with mortals and producing demigod offspring, heroes like Hercules and Perseus, beings who were stronger and more capable than normal humans, but still mortal, still flawed.
Norse mythology speaks of the Jotnar, giants who opposed the gods and brought chaos to the ordered world. Hindu texts describe the Asuras, powerful beings who rebelled against the Devas and were cast down. Even Native American legends include stories of giants, of sky people who descended and taught knowledge, of beings who were destroyed in a great flood. The skeptical explanation for these parallels is that humans across cultures independently developed similar myths to explain natural phenomena or to process cultural anxieties about power and chaos. The alternative explanation, the one that people who take Enoch seriously would propose, is that these myths are not independent creations, but fragmented memories of the same event, the same rebellion, the same descent, told and retold across generations until the details changed, but the core remained. Angels, or gods, or sky beings descending, taking human form, producing offspring, and being punished for it. If that's the case, then Enoch's account is not unique mythology. It's the most complete version of a story that every culture remembers in some form, and the reason we don't recognize it as history is because we've been taught to see myth and history as separate categories, when perhaps, in the ancient world, they were the same thing, just told in different languages. And then there's the physical evidence, the reports that won't go away. In 1819, soldiers at Lompoc Rancho in California reportedly unearthed a skeleton over 12 feet tall, with a double row of teeth, surrounded by carved shells and stone axes. The discovery was published in local records, but the remains were reburied on the orders of authorities after local tribes began attaching spiritual significance to the find. In 1870, workers digging near West Hickory, Pennsylvania, claimed they found a skeleton nearly 18 feet long, alongside a rusted iron helmet and a sword over 9 feet in length. The account appeared in the Oil City Times, but no museum claimed the remains, and no follow-up investigation was ever recorded. In modern South Africa, photographs surfaced showing what appeared to be an enormous humanoid skeleton with unusually thick bones and a massive skull, along with a footprint in stone measuring over 3 feet long. Skeptics claimed the images were digitally altered, but witnesses insisted the discovery was real before it was removed. These accounts are difficult to verify. They rely on old newspaper clippings, oral histories, and photographs that can't be authenticated. But the pattern is consistent. Large skeletons discovered, briefly reported, and then disappeared, either removed by authorities or claimed by institutions that never displayed them. And the question this raises, the question that people who believe the Nephilim were real continue to ask, is why? If these skeletons are hoaxes, why not debunk them publicly? If they're real, why hide them? The answer, according to some researchers, is that they challenge the accepted narrative. They don't fit evolutionary timelines. They suggest that human history is more complex and stranger than the textbooks allow, and institutions, whether scientific or religious, prefer narratives they can control. Maybe the reason the story of the Watchers still haunts us, still feels relevant even thousands of years after it was written, is because it's a story about boundaries, about what happens when boundaries that are meant to be respected get crossed. The Watchers were supposed to observe, not interfere. They crossed that boundary. They were celestial beings, not physical, but they took physical form. Another boundary crossed. They were immortal, but they desired mortal women. Boundary crossed. And from each crossing came consequences, corruption spreading outward like ripples in water, until the entire world was drowning in the chaos they'd unleashed. We live in a world obsessed with breaking boundaries. We celebrate the transgressive, the disruptive, the innovator who refuses to accept limits. And sometimes that's good. Sometimes boundaries are unjust and need to be challenged. But the story of the Watchers asks us to consider whether all boundaries are arbitrary, whether some exist for reasons we don't fully understand, whether crossing them, even with good intentions, might unleash consequences we're not prepared to handle. Genetic engineering lets us edit the code of life, but do we understand the long-term effects? Artificial intelligence gives us tools of immense power, but do we have the wisdom to control what we create? The Watchers had knowledge, they had desire, they had the ability to act, but they lacked the restraint, the humility, to ask whether they should. And there's another lesson here, darker and harder to accept. The Watchers didn't act alone. They convinced each other. They made an oath. They shared the guilt so no one could claim innocence. Evil, in this story, is not just individual, it's collective, social, reinforced by the group. How many times in history have atrocities been committed not by lone madmen, but by ordinary people who convinced each other that what they were doing was justified, necessary, even righteous? The Watchers bound themselves by oath, because alone they might have hesitated. Together, they became capable of anything. And that's a warning that echoes through every generation, because the same dynamic that led angels to fall can lead humans to justify horrors, as long as everyone agrees, as long as no one breaks rank, as long as the group moves forward together. But the story doesn't end with the Watchers and their corruption. It ends with judgment. And that's where we're going next. To the response from heaven, to the archangels sent to restore order, to the punishment of the fallen and the cleansing of the earth. Can you feel the weight of this? Can you feel how the story presses on something inside you, something that recognizes this pattern, even if you've never heard it articulated this way before? Because next, we're going to witness what happens when heaven says, enough. When the archangels descend, not to observe, not to desire, but to execute judgment. 4 angels, 4 missions. Uriel, sent to warn Noah that the flood is coming. Raphael, commanded to bind Azazel in the desert, to throw him into a pit of jagged rocks and cover him with darkness until the day of final judgment. Michael, tasked with confronting the remaining Watchers, forcing them to watch their children destroy each other. And Gabriel, ordered to set the Nephilim against one another, to turn their violence inward until they consume themselves. This is not the gentle, comforting heaven of Sunday school. This is the heaven of the Book of Enoch, where justice is swift and punishment is physical, where rebellious angels are imprisoned in a place called Tartarus, a word borrowed from Greek mythology, a prison beneath the earth in darkness and chains, waiting for the end of all things. And the question this raises, the question that made theologians uncomfortable enough to remove Enoch from the canon, is whether angels, these spiritual beings of light, can really be bound in physical chains, whether heaven and hell are actual places or just states of being. And if the answer is that they're real, physical, located somewhere in the architecture of creation, then everything changes. The cosmology shifts. And we're forced to ask what else we've been told that might be incomplete, sanitized, edited for comfort. The judgment is coming. The archangels are descending, and the Watchers, who thought they could cross every boundary without consequence, are about to learn otherwise. Walk with me into the darkness beneath the world, where the fallen wait, and see what divine justice looks like when mercy runs out. Chapter 3. The Judgment. Heaven's Response. You're deep beneath the earth now, in a place that has no name in any language spoken by the living. The darkness here is not the absence of light, it's something thicker, more substantial, as if darkness itself has weight and texture and the ability to press against your skin. The air smells of sulfur and stone and something else, something ancient and wrong, like the scent of fear crystallized over millennia. You can hear breathing in the distance, slow and labored, the breath of something massive, something that should not be breathing at all, because breath implies life, and what exists here is not alive in any way you understand. It's suspended, bound, held in a state between existence and oblivion, waiting for a judgment that has not yet come, but will come, must come, because the universe cannot hold this tension forever. This is Tartarus, the prison beneath the world, the place where the fallen Watchers were thrown after their rebellion, after their descent, after the chaos they unleashed forced heaven to respond with a violence that matched their transgression. The name comes from Greek mythology, the deepest pit of the underworld where the Titans were imprisoned after they lost their war against the Olympian gods. And the fact that a Jewish text, written centuries before Greek and Hebrew cultures blended in the Hellenistic period, uses this specific word has troubled scholars for generations. Some argue it's evidence of later Greek influence, that the Book of Enoch was edited or expanded by writers familiar with Greek mythology. Others suggest the opposite, that the Greeks borrowed from older Semitic traditions, that the memory of this prison, this place of binding and darkness, was so ancient and so widespread that every culture remembered it under different names. Tartarus in Greek, Sheol in Hebrew, the abyss in Christian apocalyptic literature. Different words, same reality. You reach out in the darkness and your hand touches stone, cold and damp and rough with edges that cut like broken glass. Somewhere nearby, you hear the rattle of chains, iron links scraping against rock. And then a voice, low and tortured, speaking words in a language you don't recognize, but somehow understand, because suffering transcends language, and what you're hearing is the sound of a being that once stood in the presence of God, that once sang in the celestial choirs, that once walked in light, now reduced to this, chained in darkness, waiting. The voice is not asking for mercy. It's not pleading. It's simply enduring, breath after breath, century after century, because time moves differently here, or perhaps doesn't move at all. Perhaps this moment of binding stretches on forever, an eternal present where the fallen exist in the awareness of what they lost and what they'll never have again. You close your eyes, though it makes no difference in this absolute darkness, and you try to understand how it came to this, how beings of light, creatures made to worship and serve and reflect the glory of their Creator, could fall so far. And the answer, the one the Book of Enoch gives, is both simple and terrible. They wanted, they desired, they saw something beautiful and decided that observing was not enough, that they deserved to possess what they saw. And that desire, unchecked, led them here, to chains and darkness, and the complete absence of everything they once were. The judgment of the Watchers did not happen all at once. According to the Book of Enoch, it unfolded in stages, each one deliberate, each one designed to match the specific sin committed. And the architects of this judgment were 4 archangels: Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel, each given a mission by God in response to the cries rising from the corrupted earth. The text describes how the blood of the slain reached heaven, how the groaning of humanity under the violence of the Nephilim became so loud that the archangels brought the matter before the throne. And God's response was immediate. Restore order, punish the guilty, preserve the remnant, and cleanse the earth so that creation can begin again. Uriel was sent first, not to the Watchers, but to Noah. His mission was to warn. The Book of Enoch says that Uriel appeared to Noah and told him what was coming, the flood that would cover the earth, the destruction of all flesh, the end of the world as it existed. And Uriel instructed Noah to hide himself, to build an ark, to prepare for survival, because though the earth would be cleansed, a remnant of humanity would be preserved, and through that remnant, God's plan would continue. This aligns with the Genesis account, where Noah is described as righteous, as walking with God, as finding favor in the Lord's eyes. But Enoch adds detail. It wasn't just that Noah happened to be righteous, it was that he was warned, prepared, given specific instructions by an archangel who knew what was coming. And the implication is that Noah's survival was not luck or random selection, it was divine intervention. A conscious decision to preserve one family so that the genetic line of humanity, uncorrupted by the Nephilim, could continue. Raphael's mission was more direct. He was commanded to bind Azazel, the watcher who taught humanity the art of war, who showed them how to forge swords and shields, how to make instruments of violence. And according to Enoch, Raphael descended to the desert, to a place called Dudael. And there he seized Azazel, bound his hands and feet, and threw him into a pit filled with jagged rocks, sharp stones that cut and tear.
And then Raphael covered the pit with darkness, sealing Azazel inside. And the text says he will remain there until the day of judgment, until the great final reckoning, when he will be cast into fire and consumed. This is not a metaphor. The language is physical, visceral, specific. Azazel is not in a state of spiritual separation. He's in a literal prison, in pain, in darkness, waiting for a sentence that has not yet been fully executed. And this is where the theology gets complicated, where the Book of Enoch challenges the comfortable abstractions of later religious thought. Because if Azazel is bound in a physical place, if jagged rocks cut his flesh and darkness covers him like a weight, then angels are not purely spiritual. They have some form of physicality. They can be bound. They can feel pain. And punishment for them is not just a change in status or a removal from God's presence. It's suffering, real and prolonged, and designed to match the severity of their crime. This made many later theologians uncomfortable, including Augustine, who argued that angels are immaterial, that they cannot be harmed by physical means, and therefore stories like this must be symbolic, allegories for spiritual truths, not literal accounts. But the early church fathers, before Augustine's interpretation became dominant, read Enoch literally, and they saw no contradiction, because in their cosmology, the spiritual and physical were not separate realms. They were interwoven, and beings from one could manifest in the other, which is exactly what the Watchers did when they descended, and exactly what the Archangels did when they came to execute judgment. Michael's task was different, more psychological, more cruel in its precision. He was told to go to the remaining Watchers, the ones who had not been bound yet, and to show them something, to force them to witness the destruction of their children, the Nephilim, as they turned on each other in violence. The text says that Michael was commanded to announce to the Watchers that they would watch their beloved sons destroy one another, that the corruption they introduced would consume itself, and that they, the fathers, would be powerless to stop it, bound and helpless as their legacy tore itself apart. This is judgment as forced observation, punishment that mirrors the original sin, because the Watchers were supposed to observe without interfering. But they interfered, and now they are forced to observe without the ability to interfere. To watch as everything they created, everything they thought they were building, collapses into chaos. Gabriel's mission was to execute that collapse. He was sent to the Nephilim with a single command: incite them against each other, turn their violence inward, make them destroy one another. And the text describes how Gabriel set the sons of the Watchers against each other in battle, how the giants, who had terrorized humanity, who had consumed everything in their path, now consumed each other, and the earth ran red with their blood. And their spirits, when their bodies finally fell, did not ascend, did not return to heaven or sink into rest. Instead, they remained, wandering the earth as demons, disembodied and angry, and forever seeking to corrupt, to possess, to influence, because they were born of a union that should never have happened, and their existence, even in death, remains a violation of the natural order. This idea that the spirits of the Nephilim became demons is one of the most influential and least acknowledged contributions of the Book of Enoch to later Jewish and Christian demonology. The New Testament speaks of demons, of unclean spirits, of beings that possess humans and cause madness and disease. But it never explains where they came from. It assumes the reader already knows, and the reason the early Christians assumed their readers knew
is because they were familiar with Enoch.
They understood that demons were not fallen angels, at least not originally. They were the disembodied offspring of fallen angels, cursed to wander without rest, without purpose, without the ability to die. And that's why they seek bodies to inhabit, why they're drawn to humans, because they're trying to reclaim the physical existence they lost, even temporarily, even incompletely. And then there's the flood itself. Genesis describes it as God's response to human wickedness. The earth was corrupt, violence filled the land, and God regretted making man. So he decided to wipe the slate clean and start over with Noah. But Enoch adds a layer that Genesis only hints at. The flood was not just about human sin, it was about genetic corruption, about the contamination of the human bloodline by the Nephilim, about the need to cleanse not just behavior but biology, to remove from the earth the hybrid beings that should never have existed, and to preserve, in Noah's family, a pure line, uncorrupted by angelic interference, so that humanity could continue as it was meant to be. This interpretation, that the flood was partly eugenic, partly about preserving the integrity of the human genome, is controversial, uncomfortable, and yet it makes sense of details in Genesis that otherwise seem strange, like the emphasis on Noah being perfect in his generations, a phrase that could mean morally blameless, but could also mean genetically pure, untainted by Nephilim blood. After the flood, the world was reset, but not completely. Genesis 6 verse 4 includes a cryptic phrase that has puzzled readers for millennia. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Afterward. After what? After the flood. But if the flood was supposed to destroy the Nephilim, how could they be there afterward? Some scholars suggest that the phrase is just poor editing, that an earlier tradition about pre-flood giants got mixed with a later tradition about post-flood giants, and no one bothered to reconcile them. Others argue that some Nephilim bloodline survived, perhaps through the wives of Noah's sons, or perhaps through isolated populations that the flood didn't reach, or perhaps, as Enoch suggests, through their spirits, which continued to influence the world even after their bodies were destroyed. The Canaanite giants that the Israelites encountered when they entered the Promised Land, the Anakim, the Rephaim, are they descendants of the Nephilim? Or are they just unusually tall humans that later writers exaggerated into monsters? The text doesn't give a clear answer, but the ambiguity, the sense that something from before the flood survived and lingered, adds to the unsettling nature of the story. The use of the word Tartarus is particularly significant because it's the only place in the entire biblical tradition, including Enoch, where a Greek term for the underworld is adopted directly into a Jewish text. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, the New Testament briefly mentions that God cast sinning angels into Tartarus, using the Greek word tartaru, to cast into Tartarus. And this is clearly a reference to the same tradition Enoch describes, the binding of the watchers in a subterranean prison. But why use a Greek word? Why not just say Sheol or Gehenna or the pit? The most likely explanation is that by the time 2 Peter was written, in the 1st or 2nd century AD, the story of the Watchers and their imprisonment had become so well known across Jewish and early Christian communities that Tartarus had become the standard term, borrowed from Greek, but referring to the same place Enoch described. And the fact that a New Testament author felt comfortable using it suggests that the story was not fringe, not obscure, but widely accepted, part of the shared cosmology of the time. What does it mean that evil can be bound? That's the question the story of Tartarus raises. We live in a world where evil feels ambient, pervasive, like it's woven into the fabric of existence, and most religious traditions teach us to think of evil as a force, a tendency, a corruption of the good, not something with a location, not something that can be chained and imprisoned. But the Book of Enoch insists otherwise.
It says that some evil is not abstract, it's personal, embodied in beings who made choices and now face consequences. And those consequences are not just spiritual, they're physical, spatial, located somewhere in the architecture of creation, beneath the earth, in darkness, in chains. And if that's true, if evil can be bound, then it can also be released. The text makes it clear that the watchers are imprisoned until the day of judgment, not forever, until a specific moment when the sentence will be fully executed. And the implication is that what's bound now could, under certain conditions, be unbound. That Tartarus is not a permanent solution but a holding cell, a way to contain the corruption until the final reckoning. And that raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of time, about whether we're living in the age of binding or approaching the age of release, about whether the chaos we see in the world now is the result of new evils or old ones breaking free. There's also a lesson here about collective guilt and individual punishment. The watchers swore an oath together. They shared the guilt. They convinced each other that what they were doing was justified. But when judgment came, each was punished individually. Azazel bound in one place, the others elsewhere, each experiencing the consequences of the shared decision in isolation. And that's a pattern we see throughout history. Movements that begin with shared ideology, with collective action, with the safety of numbers. But when they collapse, when the reckoning comes, each participant faces their own accounting, and the group that made them feel invincible dissolves, leaving only individuals and their choices and the weight of what they've done. But the judgment of the watchers, severe as it was only the beginning. Because the beings they created, the Nephilim, left something behind. Not just bones buried in the earth, but spirits wandering, seeking, corrupting. And that's where the story turns from ancient history to present danger. Because if the demons of the world are the ghosts of the Nephilim, then the war that started before the flood is still happening. Do you feel it? The shift in the story? The way it's moving from past to present? From something that happened long ago to something that might still be happening now. Because next we're leaving the prison of the watchers and ascending to the throne room of heaven. We're entering the book of parables, where Enoch receives visions of the future, where he sees a figure seated beside God, a figure called the Son of Man, described with such precision, such detail, that when early Christians read these words, they believed Enoch had seen Jesus, 200 years before he was born. This is where the Book of Enoch becomes more than ancient history, more than a story about fallen angels and giants. This is where it becomes prophecy, where it speaks of judgment not just for the watchers, but for all of humanity, where it describes a day when books will be opened and deeds revealed, and every secret brought to light. And at the center of that judgment sits a figure who is both human and divine, hidden with God since before the stars were made, waiting for the appointed time to be revealed. And the question this section forces us to ask is whether Enoch really saw the Messiah, whether the visions were real, whether the Son of Man he describes is the same person Christians worship, and if so, what does it mean that this knowledge existed centuries before the Incarnation? That the plan was laid out, recorded, preserved in a book that the world forgot, but never completely lost. The path continues upward now, out of the darkness, into the light. And the vision Enoch is about to share will challenge everything you think you know about prophecy, about the Messiah, about the nature of time and revelation. The throne room is waiting. The Son of Man is seated, and the books of judgment are about to open. Chapter 4, The Son of Man, Messiah before Christ. You're standing in the throne room of heaven now, though standing might be the wrong word because you're not sure if you have a body here or if you're simply consciousness, awareness suspended in a space that defies every physical law you understand. The light is impossible to describe, not because it's too bright, but because it's the wrong kind of light. Light that doesn't just illuminate but reveals, that strips away pretense and shadow and shows things as they truly are. and you find yourself grateful that you're seeing this place through Enoch's eyes, through vision rather than direct experience, because you sense that if you were really here, in your actual body with all its weight and weakness and sin, you would not survive the exposure. You would burn away like morning fog under the sun, insubstantial, revealed as nothing. The throne itself rises before you, and you cannot look directly at it, cannot focus on the figure seated there, because the glory is too intense, the holiness too concentrated, and your eyes, even in vision, slide away, finding refuge instead in the surrounding presence. The angels that fill this space like stars fill the night sky, thousands upon thousands of them, beings of light and fire and sound, their voices rising in worship that has no beginning and no end. A song that has been sung since before time existed and will continue after time has run its course. You feel small here, infinitely small, not in a way that diminishes you, but in a way that puts everything in perspective, that reminds you that whatever happens on earth, however vast our dramas and tragedies seem, they are playing out under the gaze of something far greater, far older, far more patient than we can comprehend. And then Enoch, standing beside you in this vision, points to something you hadn't noticed. Seated beside the throne, not on it, but beside it, close enough to suggest intimacy, authority, shared purpose, is another figure. This one you can look at, barely, and what you see stops your breath. He appears human, or human-like, with the form of a man, but something about him suggests he's more than that, older than that, as if humanity is a garment he's wearing rather than what he fundamentally is. His face is radiant but not blinding, beautiful in a way that makes you ache, and his eyes, when they sweep across the assembled hosts, carry the weight of absolute knowledge, as if nothing is hidden from him, nothing forgotten, every deed and thought and intention laid bare under his gaze. "The Son of Man," Enoch whispers, though whisper seems inadequate for the way his voice carries in this place, resonating through the light itself. The elect one, the righteous one. He was hidden with the Lord of Spirits before the sun and stars were created, and now he is revealed to the holy and the elect. You stare at this figure, trying to understand what you're seeing, and a question rises in your mind that you cannot suppress. If this vision happened in the 3rd or 2nd century before Christ, if Enoch or whoever wrote in his name really saw this, then who is this Son of Man? And why does he look so much like the Jesus that Christians would worship 200 years later? The Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71 of 1st Enoch, is structured as 3 extended visions, 3 separate revelations that Enoch receives while in the heavenly realms, and at the center of all 3 is this figure, the Son of Man, described with a consistency and detail that's remarkable given how fragmented and symbolic most apocalyptic literature tends to be. This is not vague prophecy, not ambiguous poetry that could mean anything depending on interpretation. This is specific, almost portrait-like in its precision. And when early Christians read these chapters, they saw not a prediction of a future Messiah, but a description of the one they already knew, already worshipped, already believed had walked the earth in human form. Chapter 48 describes the Son of Man as one in whom wisdom dwells, whose presence brings light to the nations, whose name was known before the sun and stars were made. And this language, this specific phrasing about pre-existence, about being named before creation, appears almost identically in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is called the Word, the Logos, who was with God in the beginning, through whom all things were made, and who became flesh and dwelt among us. The parallel is not subtle, it's direct, unmistakable. And the question scholars have wrestled with for centuries is whether John borrowed from Enoch, whether both were drawing from a common tradition, or whether, impossibly, they were describing the same reality from different vantage points. Enoch from vision, John from lived experience. Chapter 46 describes a moment when Enoch sees the Ancient of Days, a title for God, seated on the throne, and beside him stands one with the appearance of a man, and this figure is called the Son of Man. And Enoch is told that this is the one who will judge the wicked, who will bring down the mighty from their thrones, who will give rest to the weary and hope to the righteous. The language echoes Daniel chapter 7, where the prophet sees one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. But Enoch expands on Daniel's vision, giving the figure personality, mission, authority, making clear that this is not just a symbol of Israel, or of humanity in general, but a specific individual with a specific role in the divine plan. And that role is judgment, redemption, and the restoration of creation. In chapter 62, the vision becomes even more explicit. Enoch describes a day when the Son of Man will sit on the throne of glory, when the books will be opened and the secrets of the righteous revealed, when those who denied the name of the Lord of spirits will be judged and found wanting, and the kings and the mighty will plead for mercy, but find none, because they did not show mercy when they had power. And the righteous, those who suffered in the world, will be vindicated, clothed in garments of glory, and given eternal life in the presence of the Son of Man. This is the final judgment, the great reckoning. And what's striking about Enoch's description is how closely it aligns with Jesus' own words in the Gospels, particularly in Matthew chapter 25, where Jesus describes himself as the Son of Man seated on a glorious throne, separating the sheep from the goats, judging the nations based on how they treated the least of these, rewarding the righteous with eternal life, and sending the wicked into eternal punishment. The similarities are too numerous, too specific to be coincidental. Either the writers of the New Testament were familiar with the Book of Enoch and deliberately used its language and imagery to describe Jesus, or Jesus himself was familiar with the text and consciously adopted the title Son of Man, along with its messianic connotations, as a way of identifying himself with Enoch's vision. Or, and this is the possibility that makes some theologians uncomfortable and others excited, Enoch really did see Jesus, 200 years before the incarnation, in a vision that transcended time, that showed him not what would happen, but what, from heaven's perspective, had already happened. Because if God exists outside time, if past and future are equally present to the divine mind, then Enoch's vision of the Son of Man could be simultaneous with the historical life of Jesus, not prediction, but observation across temporal boundaries. What makes this interpretation compelling, beyond the textual parallels, is the way early Christians treated the Book of Enoch. The Epistle of Jude, as we've mentioned, quotes it directly, calling Enoch a prophet, and attributing to him specific words about the Lord coming with thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment. Church fathers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, all reference the Book of Enoch, and while they don't universally accept every detail, they treat it as a legitimate source of insight into angelic rebellion, messianic prophecy, and eschatological judgment. It's only later, in the 4th and 5th centuries, as the canon is being formalized and theology is being systematized, that the book begins to disappear from mainstream Christian use, and the reasons for that disappearance are revealing. One reason is the question of authorship. The book claims to be written by Enoch, but even early readers knew that it was composed much later, probably in the 3rd to 1st centuries BC, by unknown Jewish authors working in the apocalyptic tradition. And while pseudepigraphy, writing under a famous name, was common and accepted in the ancient world, it made later Christians nervous, especially as they were trying to establish clear criteria for what counted as inspired scripture. And a book that was demonstrably not written by its attributed author, no matter how spiritually valuable, became harder to defend as canonical. But there's another reason, more theological, and it has to do with control, with who gets to define the nature of the Messiah. Because the Son of Man in Enoch is not meek and mild. He's not primarily a teacher or a healer. He's a judge, seated on a throne, wielding absolute authority, bringing down the powerful and vindicating the oppressed. And that's a dangerous image in a world where Christianity was becoming the religion of the powerful, where emperors and kings were converting, and the church was aligning itself with political authority. Because if the Messiah's primary role is to judge the mighty, to strip power from those who abuse it, then the church that represents him should be doing the same, should be challenging power rather than consolidating it. And that's not a message that serves institutional interests. There's also the matter of the Son of Man's pre-existence. Enoch makes it clear that this figure existed before creation, that his name was spoken before the sun and stars were made, that he was hidden with God and then revealed at the appointed time. And this language supports a high Christology, a view of Jesus as fully divine, eternally existent, not adopted or elevated at some point in his earthly life, but always the Son, always with the Father. And while this view eventually became orthodox through the councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon, in the earlier centuries there was significant debate, with some Christians arguing that Jesus was a created being, exalted by God but not co-eternal with him. And the Book of Enoch, with its clear statement of the Son of Man's pre-existence, would have been ammunition in that debate, which might be exactly why it was quietly removed from circulation, because texts that are too useful to one side of a theological argument can become dangerous to institutional unity. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Enoch's vision, the part that even sympathetic readers find difficult, is the role of the Son of Man in judgment. This is not just passive separation, not just a declaration of who is saved and who is not. This is active participation in punishment, in the binding of the wicked, in the execution of sentence. And the text describes how the Son of Man will command the angels, how he will oversee the destruction of those who opposed the righteous, how he will personally ensure that justice is carried out. And for readers who prefer a gentler image of the Messiah, who emphasize mercy over judgment, love over wrath, this is uncomfortable. It suggests that the same figure who brings light and hope to the oppressed brings terror and destruction to the oppressor. And both are necessary. Both are part of his role. Because justice, real justice, cannot exist without the punishment of injustice. And this brings us back to the question that haunts this entire section of Enoch. Was this vision real? Did the author, or authors of the Book of Parables, really receive a revelation from heaven? Or is this simply theological speculation, an attempt to imagine what the Messiah would be like based on existing scriptural traditions like Daniel and the Psalms, dressed up in visionary language to give it authority? The skeptical answer is obvious. It's literature, sophisticated religious literature produced by a community trying to make sense of their suffering under foreign oppression, trying to imagine a future where God would intervene, where justice would be served, where the wicked would face consequences and the righteous would be vindicated. And the figure of the Son of Man is a projection of their hopes, not a vision of a real being. But the other answer, the one that early Christians clearly believed, is that Enoch saw something true, that the vision, even if received and recorded by later writers under his name, was genuine, that heaven opened and showed the author what would come, or what, from heaven's timeless perspective, already was, and that the Son of Man, described in such detail, is the same person who would walk the dusty roads of Galilee, heal the sick, challenge the powerful, die on a Roman cross, and rise again, fulfilling not just the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah, but also the vision of Enoch, the man who walked with God and was taken. What does it mean if prophecy can see across time? That's the question the Book of Parables forces us to ask. We tend to think of prophecy as prediction, as foreknowledge, as someone in the past receiving information about the future. But what if that's the wrong model? What if prophecy is not about time at all, but about perspective, about standing in a place where past and future are visible simultaneously, where the sequence of events that we experience as linear, as one thing following another, is actually laid out all at once, and the prophet is simply describing what they see from that elevated vantage point. If that's what happened to Enoch, if he was taken to a place outside time and shown the Son of Man not as a future event, but as a present reality, then his vision is not prediction, it's testimony. And the fact that it was written down 200 years before Jesus was born is irrelevant, because from where Enoch stood, Jesus was already there, already seated, already serving in the role he would later fulfill on earth. This challenges our comfortable assumptions about how revelation works. We like to think of it as orderly, progressive, as God slowly revealing more and more truth over time, building from the law to the prophets to the Gospels in a neat developmental arc. But if Enoch saw Jesus before the prophets, if the full revelation of the Messiah's identity and role was available to those with eyes to see centuries before the incarnation, then revelation is not progressive. It's scattered. It appears where and when God chooses. And the fact that we lost the Book of Enoch, that it was removed from the canon and forgotten, means we lost a piece of that revelation. And maybe we're only now, with its rediscovery, able to see the full picture again. There's also something humbling about the idea that the answer was there all along, written in a text that most of the world ignored, preserved in a remote corner of Ethiopia, while the rest of Christianity moved on without it. Because it suggests that truth doesn't depend on consensus, doesn't require institutional approval. It persists whether we acknowledge it or not, waiting for anyone curious enough, brave enough, to go looking. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Son of Man vision, that the truth about the Messiah, about judgment, about the coming restoration of all things, is not hidden because God is secretive, but because we stopped looking. We accepted the edited version, the safe version, and forgot to ask what might have been left out. Can you see him, the Son of Man, seated beside the throne, his eyes sweeping across the assembled hosts, his presence radiating authority and judgment and mercy all at once? Because this is not the end of Enoch's vision, this is only the beginning, the establishment of who the Messiah is and what role he plays in the cosmic drama. But the Book of Parables has more to show us, more to reveal about the final judgment, about the opening of the books, about the fate of the wicked and the vindication of the righteous. And it all centers on this figure, this Son of Man, who is both utterly divine and somehow, mysteriously, connected to humanity, bearing our form, representing our cause, standing in the gap between heaven and earth. But before we dive deeper into that judgment, before we see the books opened and the secrets revealed, we need to step back, to shift our perspective from the throne room to the heavens themselves. Because Enoch didn't just see visions of the Messiah and the final judgment, he also received knowledge about the cosmos, about time and the movement of celestial bodies, about the structure of creation itself. And that knowledge, recorded in the Astronomical book, is just as strange, just as challenging to our assumptions as anything we've encountered so far, because it suggests that ancient people knew things about the universe that they shouldn't have known, that someone taught them. And if the Watchers taught humanity forbidden knowledge before the flood, then who taught Enoch? Who showed him the secrets of the heavens, and why? The throne room fades now, the vision shifts, and you find yourself standing under an open sky, stars blazing overhead, and beside you stands the angel Uriel, and he's pointing upward, tracing constellations with his finger, and he's about to show you how time really works. Chapter 5, The Astronomical Book, Secrets of Time. You're standing on a desert plateau now, somewhere in the ancient Near East, 200 years before Christ, and the night sky above you is unlike anything you've ever seen in the modern world. There are no cities here, no streetlights bleeding orange into the darkness, no glow of civilization softening the edges of night, just pure, absolute darkness, punctuated by stars so bright they seem close enough to touch, close enough to whisper secrets if you listen carefully enough. The Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of light, and you can see planets with your naked eye, Venus burning white near the horizon, Mars glowing red overhead, Jupiter steady and bright. And as you stand there, neck craned back, breath visible in the cold desert air, you understand for the first time why ancient people were obsessed with the heavens, because up there, in that vast darkness, patterns emerge, rhythms become visible, and the universe reveals itself as something ordered, intentional, designed. Beside you stands the angel Uriel, and his presence is different from the crushing weight of the throne room, different from the terror of Tartarus. This is knowledge rather than judgment, teaching rather than punishment. And when he speaks, his voice carries the patience of someone who has all the time in the world, because time, for him, is not a constraint, but a tool, something he understands in ways you cannot yet grasp. "I will show you the heavenly luminaries," he says, and he raises his hand, tracing invisible lines across the sky, connecting stars into patterns. And as he does, you begin to see what you couldn't see before, that the stars are not random, not scattered across the void without purpose. They move in cycles, they follow paths, they mark time in ways that are precise, mathematical, beautiful. "The sun," Uriel says, pointing to the eastern horizon where the first hint of dawn is beginning to show, travels through 12 gates, 6 in the east and 6 in the west, and as it moves from gate to gate, the length of day and night changes, and this movement marks the seasons, the months, the years. You watch as he describes the path of the sun, how it rises further north in summer and further south in winter, how the angle of its light changes, how the shadows lengthen and shorten. And you realize that what he's describing is not mysticism or poetry. It's astronomy, precise observational astronomy, the kind of knowledge that requires generations of careful watching, of recording, of calculating. And yet, here it is, being delivered to Enoch as revelation, as if someone who already knows the mechanics of the universe is simply explaining them, rather than teaching them from scratch. "The moon," Uriel continues, "waxes and wanes in a cycle that repeats every 29.5 days, and its light is borrowed from the sun, growing full when it faces the sun and dark when it turns away." Again, the description is accurate, not mythological, not attributing personality or deity to the moon, but describing it as a physical object operating under consistent laws. And the question that rises in your mind, the question you cannot suppress, is how did ancient people know this? How did they understand orbital mechanics and reflected light and the mathematics of celestial cycles without telescopes, without computers, without the accumulated knowledge of modern science, unless someone taught them? Unless someone who already understood showed them what to look for. The Astronomical Book. Chapters 72 through 82 of 1st Enoch is the oldest section of the entire text, likely composed in the 3rd century BC, and it presents a solar calendar of 364 days, divided into 4 seasons of exactly 91 days each, with each season containing 3 months of 30 days plus 1 additional day to maintain the balance, creating a perfect cycle of 52 weeks, each week beginning on a Wednesday, the 4th day of creation, the day when, according to Genesis, God created the sun and moon and stars and set them in the sky to mark seasons and days and years. This calendar is not an approximation. It's not a rough attempt to track time. It's precise, intentional, designed to align human activity with cosmic rhythms. and the text claims that this knowledge was given to Enoch by Uriel, revealed as part of his journey through the heavenly realms. What makes this significant, what makes scholars pay attention even when they're skeptical of the rest of Enoch's content, is that this calendar system was actually used. We know this because the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century, include calendrical texts that follow the same 364-day solar year described in Enoch. And the community at Qumran, the group that produced or preserved the scrolls, rejected the lunar calendar used by the Jerusalem temple priesthood, considering it corrupt, inaccurate, out of sync with the true divine order. And they based their rejection on texts like the Astronomical book, which they viewed as authoritative, as containing knowledge given directly from heaven about how time should be measured and marked. The problem with a 364-day calendar, from a practical standpoint, is that the solar year is actually 365 and a quarter days long, which means a purely solar calendar of 364 days will drift, losing about a day and a quarter every year, and over time, the seasons will shift. Spring will arrive earlier, winter later, and the whole system will become unreliable for agriculture, which depends on accurate prediction of growing seasons. The Qumran community must have been aware of this drift. They were not unsophisticated. They were meticulous record keepers. And yet, they insisted on the 364-day calendar, which suggests they valued symbolic perfection over practical accuracy. They believed that the divine order was a year of exactly 52 weeks, perfectly divisible, and any deviation from that was human error or cosmic corruption, not a flaw in the revealed system. But there's another possibility, one that researchers into ancient astronomy have begun to explore, which is that the 364-day calendar was never meant to be used alone. It was meant to be combined with observation, with intercalation, with adjustment based on actual solar and lunar phenomena. And the Astronomical book, despite its precision, includes references to additional days, to weeks of years, to longer cycles that might have functioned as correction mechanisms, ensuring that the ideal calendar stayed aligned with the actual movement of the heavens. And if that's the case, then what Enoch received was not just a simple calendar, but a sophisticated system, a framework for understanding time that balanced mathematical elegance with observational accuracy. The level of detail in the Astronomical book is startling. It describes how the sun rises and sets at different points on the horizon throughout the year, moving through what the text calls gates. 6 gates in the east where it rises, and 6 in the west where it sets. And as the sun moves from the southernmost gate in winter to the northernmost gate in summer, the length of daylight changes. The shadows shift. The angle of the sun's rays alters the temperature and the growing conditions. And all of this is described with precision, with numbers, with ratios, as if the author had access to measurements and calculations that should not have existed in the ancient world. The text also describes the moon's phases, how it waxes from new to full over 14 days, and then wanes back to new over another 14, how its appearance changes throughout the month, how it interacts with the sun, and again, the description is not mythological. It's observational, based on careful watching and recording. And this raises the question that hangs over the entire Astronomical book. Where did this knowledge come from, if we accept that the text was written around 200 BC, and if we accept that the knowledge it contains is accurate, then how did the authors obtain it? The conventional answer is observation. Ancient people were not stupid. They watched the sky every night for generations. They noticed patterns. They recorded what they saw. And over time, they built up a body of knowledge that allowed them to predict eclipses, track planets, and create functional calendars. And there's truth to this. Ancient Babylonians were sophisticated astronomers. The Egyptians aligned their pyramids with celestial precision. The Maya developed calendars of remarkable accuracy. So it's not impossible that Jewish scholars in the Hellenistic period, drawing on both their own traditions and the astronomical knowledge of surrounding cultures, could have produced a text like the Astronomical book without any supernatural input. But the Book of Enoch doesn't present it that way. It presents this knowledge as revelation, as something given by an angel. And that framing matters because it changes the epistemological claim. It's not saying humans figured this out. It's saying humans were shown. And if we take that claim seriously, even hypothetically, then we have to ask what it would mean for advanced astronomical knowledge to be given rather than discovered. And the answer, the one that makes both skeptics and believers uncomfortable, is that it would mean someone, whether an angel or something else, had that knowledge already, possessed it completely, and chose to share it. And that implies a level of understanding of the cosmos that predates human science by millennia. There are artifacts that support this uncomfortable possibility. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece in 1901, is an analog computer made of bronze gears, dated to around 200 BC, the same period when the Astronomical book was being compiled. And this device could predict the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, could calculate eclipses, could track the Olympic Games cycle, and nothing else like it appears in the historical record for over 1,000 years. It's an anomaly, an out-of-place artifact. And when researchers finally decoded how it worked, using X-ray tomography and computer modeling, they were stunned by its sophistication, by the precision of its gears, by the astronomical knowledge embedded in its design. And the question they kept asking is, who built this? Who understood the cosmos well enough in 200 BC to create a machine that would not be matched until the Renaissance? Or consider the Baghdad battery, a clay jar found in Iraq, dated to around 200 BC, containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, and when filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, it produces a measurable electric current. Now archaeologists debate what it was used for. Some suggest electroplating, others ritual purposes. But the fact remains that someone in the ancient world understood that certain combinations of metals and liquids could produce electricity. And that knowledge, like the Antikythera mechanism, like the astronomical precision in Enoch, suggests that the ancient world was not as primitive as we've been taught, that there were pockets of advanced understanding, perhaps transmitted from earlier civilizations, perhaps taught by sources we no longer remember. The pyramids of Giza, built around 2500 BC, are aligned with the constellation Orion with a precision that requires knowledge of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes which stars appear where over thousands of years. And to align the pyramids the way they're aligned, the builders would have needed to understand not just where Orion was in their time, but where it had been and where it was going, which implies either that they had records going back thousands of years, or that they had help from someone who did. And this same pattern appears in other ancient sites: Stonehenge in England, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the Nazca lines in Peru. All of them aligned with celestial phenomena, all of them requiring knowledge that seems too advanced for the cultures that built them. And the answer that the Astronomical book offers, the answer that ancient people themselves believed, is that they were taught. That knowledge of the heavens came not from slow accumulation over generations, but from revelation, from beings who already understood, who descended or appeared or communicated somehow, and taught humanity to look up, to track the movements, to understand that time is not random but structured, that the universe operates on principles that can be known, and that knowing those principles brings you closer to the divine order, closer to the mind of God, who set the stars in motion and established their paths. What the Astronomical book suggests, what it's been suggesting all along beneath its descriptions of gates and cycles and lunar phases, is that time is sacred, that the measurement of days and months and years is not just practical necessity, but spiritual practice. That aligning yourself with cosmic rhythms is a form of worship, a way of acknowledging that you are not separate from creation, but part of it, subject to the same laws, moving through the same cycles, breathing in sync with the universe that birthed you. This is a radically different view from the modern relationship with time, where we see ourselves as masters of our schedules, where we manipulate time zones and ignore circadian rhythms, and act as if sleep and wakefulness are matters of personal choice rather than biological imperative tied to the rotation of the Earth. But ancient people knew better. They understood that when you fight against natural rhythms, when you try to impose your will on time rather than flowing with it, you suffer, physically and spiritually. And modern science is slowly, reluctantly, confirming what they knew. We have circadian rhythms, internal clocks that regulate sleep and wakefulness, hormone production, body temperature, immune function. And these rhythms are controlled by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, which receives input from the eyes about light and darkness and uses that information to keep us synchronized with the 24-hour day. And when we disrupt those rhythms, when we work night shifts or stare at screens late into the night or travel across time zones, we pay a price. Increased risk of depression, obesity, diabetes, cancer, because our bodies are designed to follow the sun, just like Enoch's calendar insisted, and ignoring that design has consequences. The pineal gland, a small structure deep in the brain, produces melatonin in response to darkness, signaling to the body that it's time to sleep. And this process is not cultural, not learned. It's hardwired, built into our biology by the same forces that set the stars in motion. And the fact that a tiny gland in your skull responds to the absence of sunlight by producing a chemical that makes you drowsy is evidence that you are not separate from the cosmos. You are part of it, a small piece of a much larger pattern. And the astronomical book, in its own ancient language, was trying to tell us this, was trying to preserve the knowledge that human flourishing depends on alignment with celestial order, not domination of it. Maybe that's why this knowledge was considered sacred, why it was given by an angel rather than discovered by accident. Because understanding time, really understanding it, means understanding your place in creation, means accepting limits, means recognizing that you are not the center. And that kind of humility, that kind of cosmic perspective, is dangerous to pride, to ego, to the human tendency to believe we're special, exempt, capable of transcending the rules that govern everything else. Do you feel it? Standing under these stars, with Uriel tracing patterns in the sky. Do you feel the smallness and the significance all at once? The sense that you are tiny, but not insignificant. That you matter precisely because you're part of something vast, something ordered, something intentional. Because next, we're leaving the sky and descending back to Earth. But not the Earth as it is now. We're going back to the Earth as it was, to the generations between Adam and Noah. And we're going to see history not as a list of kings and battles, but as a symbolic drama. Animals representing nations, sheep and wolves and lions playing out the story of Israel, of humanity, of the long, slow arc from creation through corruption to judgment and renewal. This is the Book of Dreams, and it's unlike anything else in Enoch. It's allegory, dense and layered and sometimes confusing, but beneath the symbols there's a pattern, a structure, a claim that history is not random, that it follows a divine script, that every rise and fall of nations, every exile and return, every moment of suffering and redemption is part of a larger story. And that story has been seen, recorded, preserved, so that when we live through our own moments of chaos and injustice, we can know that this has happened before, that it's part of the pattern, and that the pattern, however painful, bends toward justice, toward restoration, toward the moment when the Son of Man will sit on his throne, and the books will be opened, and everything hidden will be revealed. The stars are fading now as dawn approaches. Uriel's lesson is complete, and the vision shifts again, carrying you forward through time, through history, through the symbolic language that ancient minds used to encode truth. And the story you're about to witness will show you that past and future are not as separate as you think. Chapter 6. The Book of Dreams. History as Prophecy. You're standing in a field now, somewhere between waking and dreaming, and the landscape around you is familiar yet strange, recognizable as Earth, but simplified, rendered in broad strokes like a painting, where details have been deliberately omitted to reveal underlying structure. The sky is neither day nor night, but something in between, a perpetual twilight that casts long shadows without a visible sun. And as you look around, you realize that the field is not empty. It's populated by animals, thousands of them, moving in herds and flocks. And they're not behaving like animals. They're building, organizing, warring, grieving, celebrating, acting out human dramas in animal form. And you understand with a clarity that bypasses rational thought that you're witnessing history, not as it's recorded in textbooks with dates and names and battles, but as it really is. A story with patterns and characters and themes that repeat. A drama where the same conflicts play out again and again under different costumes. And the animals are not metaphors. They are the truth beneath the metaphor. They are what we look like when the surface details are stripped away and only the essence remains. In the center of the field stands a white bull, radiant and pure, and even though no one has told you, you know this is Adam, the first man, the beginning of the story, and from him comes another white bull, and then a heifer, and you watch as the heifer gives birth to two calves, one red and one black. And the red calf, you sense immediately, is Abel, and the black calf is Cain. And you watch as the black calf attacks the red, as violence enters the world for the first time, as the ground drinks blood, and the pattern is established, red for sacrifice, black for sin, white for purity, and the colors will repeat throughout the vision, marking who is who, which side they're on, and you realize that this is not just clever symbolism, this is a language, a way of encoding truth that survives translation, survives cultural change, survives the forgetting of names and dates, because the pattern remains even when the specifics fade. More animals appear now, generations of them, white oxen and bulls representing the line of Seth, the righteous descendants of Adam who kept the knowledge of God. And among them, you see one that stands out, smaller than the others, different somehow. And you know without being told that this is Enoch, the seventh from Adam. And you watch as he's transformed, as his form shifts, as he becomes something else, not quite human, not quite animal, elevated, taken. And then he's gone, removed from the field before the corruption spreads, before the next scene unfolds. Because what comes next is darker, stranger, and you're about to witness it through eyes that see in symbols rather than facts, through a vision that compresses centuries into moments and reveals the mechanism beneath the surface of history. The sky darkens, and figures begin to descend. They look like men, but they move like stars falling. And when they land among the herds, when they begin to take the cows and heifers for themselves, you know you're watching the descent of the Watchers, the angelic rebellion rendered in pastoral imagery, and what follows, the birth of the Nephilim, the spread of violence, the judgment and the flood. All of it plays out before you in this symbolic language, and you realize that you're not just watching history, you're watching prophecy. Because the pattern that begins here will repeat, is repeating. And the question the vision asks is whether we're wise enough to recognize the pattern when it appears in our own time. The Book of Dreams, chapters 83 through 90 of 1st Enoch, contains two extended visions, But the second one, often called the animal apocalypse, is the focus, the centerpiece, the vision that retells the entire sweep of biblical history from creation to the eschaton, using animals as characters. And while this might sound like a children's fable, like Aesop or the Panchatantra, the execution is sophisticated, layered, designed for an audience that understands that symbols can carry more truth than literal description, that sometimes the best way to see the pattern is to remove the distracting details of individual personalities and specific locations, and render everything in archetypal form. And that's what the animal apocalypse does. It takes the sprawling, complicated, often contradictory accounts of Israel's history and compresses them into a coherent narrative where the good guys are sheep, the bad guys are predators, and the angels are men who watch over the flock. The vision begins with Adam as a white bull, Eve as a heifer, Cain and Abel as black and red calves, and the murder of Abel is depicted simply, the black calf pursuing the red until the red falls, and the earth drinks its blood. And then Seth is born, another white bull, and from him comes a line of cattle that remains pure, uncontaminated, until the time of the Watchers. And here the symbolism shifts. The Watchers are depicted as stars that fall from heaven and become men, or rather, beings that look like men but are something else. And these fallen stars come among the cattle and begin to breed with the cows and heifers, producing offspring that are not cattle. They're elephants and camels and asses, enormous, wrong, hybrid creatures that don't fit the natural order. And these creatures, the Nephilim in symbolic form, begin to devour everything, the resources meant for the cattle, and eventually the cattle themselves. And the violence spreads until the earth is crying out. And then the flood, depicted as a deluge that covers the field and drowns all the hybrid creatures, while one white bull, Noah, survives in a vessel. And when the waters recede, the earth is cleansed, the cattle begin to multiply again, and you'd think the story would end there, problem solved, humanity reset. But it doesn't, because the pattern repeats. New predators appear, bears and lions and foxes, representing the nations that oppress Israel, Egypt and Babylon and Assyria. And the cattle, now explicitly sheep to represent Israel's vulnerability, are scattered, hunted, lost. And a series of shepherds, 70 of them, are appointed to watch over the sheep. But these shepherds are corrupt. They allow more sheep to be devoured than they should. They fail in their duty. And the text makes clear that they will be judged for this failure, that at the end of time, when the books are opened, these shepherds will be held accountable for every sheep that died under their watch. The symbolism is dense. Every animal represents something specific. Rams are leaders like Moses and David. Wolves are enemies. Birds of prey are Babylonians who carry the sheep into exile. And as the vision progresses through Israel's history, through the conquest of Canaan, the establishment of the kingdom, the division into north and south, the destruction of the temple, the exile, the return, each event is depicted in animal form, and what's remarkable is how consistent the symbolism remains, how carefully the author or authors maintained the code, so that if you understand the key, if you know that sheep equals Israel, and wolves equal enemies, and birds equal Babylon, you can decode the entire history. You can see the pattern beneath the events. But the vision doesn't stop with the past. It moves into the future, into events that, from the perspective of the author in the 2nd century BC, had not yet happened. And this is where it becomes prophecy rather than allegory, where the animal apocalypse stops being a retelling of known history and starts predicting what's to come. And scholars debate exactly where that line is, where history ends and prophecy begins. But most agree that the section describing the Maccabean revolt, the uprising of Jewish rebels against Greek oppression in the 2nd century BC, was written during or just after those events, which means the text was being composed or edited as history unfolded, and the authors saw themselves not just as recording the past, but as living in the prophetic timeline, as witnessing the fulfillment of Enoch's vision. And then comes the climax, the moment when a white bull is born, a special bull, different from all the others. And this bull is not just pure or righteous. This bull is feared by all the other animals, revered by the sheep. And many interpreters see this as a messianic figure, the one who will lead Israel to final victory, who will establish the kingdom, who will bring judgment on the predators and vindication to the sheep. And the text says that when this white bull appears, all the animals will be transformed. They will all become white bulls. The predators will lose their threatening nature. The sheep will be elevated, and creation will be restored to its original purity, to the state it was in when Adam stood in the garden, before the fall, before the corruption, before the long descent through violence and exile and suffering. This transformation is not gradual, it's sudden, apocalyptic. It happens when the Lord of the sheep, God, depicted as a shepherd king, descends to the earth, sets up his throne, opens the books where everything is recorded, and executes judgment. The 70 corrupt shepherds who failed in their duty are thrown into a pit of fire. The predator animals who devoured the sheep are destroyed, and only the sheep remain. And then the white bull appears, and then the transformation, and then a new heaven and a new earth. Language that appears almost identically in the Book of Revelation, suggesting either that John of Patmos was familiar with Enoch's vision, or that both were drawing from a common wellspring of apocalyptic imagery that circulated in Jewish communities for centuries. What makes the animal apocalypse powerful, what has kept it relevant across millennia, is not the specific historical reference, but the pattern it reveals. Because if you strip away the names and dates, if you stop worrying about whether the wolves represent Assyria or Babylon or Rome, what you're left with is a structure, a repeating cycle where the faithful are oppressed, scattered, devoured by powers that seem invincible, and then, at the moment when all hope seems lost, when the sheep have been reduced to a remnant, judgment comes, the predators are destroyed, the faithful are vindicated, and creation is renewed. And this pattern, this rhythm of suffering and redemption, appears not just in Jewish history, but in every story of oppression and liberation. In every narrative where the weak face the strong, and somehow, against all odds, survive. And that's why the vision uses animals, because animals are universal. Every culture has predators and prey. Every child understands that wolves eat sheep, that bears are dangerous, that bulls are strong. And by rendering history in these terms, the vision transcends its specific historical moment. It becomes a template that can be applied to any situation where the powerful abuse the weak, where shepherds fail in their duty, where the faithful suffer. And the message is always the same. This has happened before. It's part of the pattern, and the pattern, no matter how dark it gets, ends with judgment and restoration, with the white bull and the transformation. With the promise that corruption is not forever, that justice delayed is not justice denied, that the books are being kept and accounts will be settled. But there's a darker implication too, which is that if the pattern repeats, if the cycle of corruption and judgment is built into the structure of history, then we're not moving towards some final resolution. We're spiraling, looping, experiencing variations of the same story again and again. And the only question is where in the cycle we are, whether we're in the time of the corrupt shepherds or the time of the scattering, whether the white bull has been born yet or is still waiting to appear. And if we're honest, if we look at the world around us, at systems that devour the vulnerable, at leaders who fail to protect those under their care, at the way power corrupts and predators thrive, we have to admit that the pattern is still active, still playing out. And we're not spectators, we're in it. We're the sheep, or the shepherds, or the predators. And the question the vision forces us to ask is which one? Which role are we playing? And when the books are opened, when the Lord of the sheep sets up his throne and calls for an accounting, Will we be among those vindicated or those condemned? Maybe the reason the animal apocalypse has survived, the reason it still resonates, is because it gives pattern to chaos. It takes the overwhelming complexity of history, the random violence, the senseless suffering, the rise and fall of nations that seem arbitrary, and it says no. There's a structure, there's a story being told. And your suffering is not meaningless. It's part of a larger narrative. And that narrative has been seen, recorded, and it ends with justice, with transformation, with the white bull and the new creation. This is not the same as saying, everything happens for a reason, which is often just a way of avoiding responsibility or denying the reality of evil. This is saying that there is a pattern to how evil operates, how it spreads, how it's eventually confronted and overcome. And understanding that pattern gives you hope. Not the cheap hope that everything will be fine, but the deep hope that corruption is not the final word, that judgment will come, that the books are being kept. But the vision also warns us about complicity, about the 70 shepherds who were supposed to protect the sheep, but instead allowed them to be devoured, who watched and did nothing, or actively participated in the oppression. And these shepherds are not depicted as obvious villains. They're not predators. They're failures. They had a duty, and they shirked it, and they're judged for that, thrown into the pit alongside the wolves and bears and lions, because inaction in the face of injustice is its own form of evil. Because if you have the power to protect and you choose not to, you're complicit. You're one of the corrupt shepherds, and when the books are opened, that will be recorded. And there's something terrifying about that, about the idea that history is being recorded, that every act of violence, every failure to intervene, every moment when power was used to oppress rather than protect, is written down somewhere, kept in books that will one day be opened. And there's no statute of limitations, no expiration date, no way to escape accountability by outliving your victims. Because the Lord of the sheep is patient. He waits. He allows the pattern to play out, but he doesn't forget, and neither do the books. And when the time comes, when the throne is set up and the judgment begins, every shepherd will give an account, and the sheep they failed to protect will testify against them. This is not a comfortable theology. It's not the gentle Jesus, meek and mild. It's the Jesus who overturned tables, who called the religious leaders whitewashed tombs, who promised that the last would be first and the first last, who said it would be better to have a millstone tied around your neck and be thrown into the sea than to harm one of these little ones. And that Jesus, the Jesus of judgment and righteous anger, is much closer to the white bull of Enoch's vision than most modern Christianity wants to admit. Can you see the pattern now? Can you recognize it in your own time, in the predators and prey, in the shepherds who fail, and the sheep who suffer? Because the animal apocalypse was not written for its own time alone. It was written for every time, for every generation that lives through oppression and wonders if justice will ever come. And the answer the vision gives is, yes, but not yet. Not until the pattern completes, not until the suffering reaches its appointed measure. And then, suddenly, decisively, the Lord of the sheep will descend, the books will be opened, and everything will change. But before we reach that final judgment, before we see the white bull in the transformation, there's one more section of Enoch to explore, one more revelation to receive. And this one is the most direct, the most urgent, because it's written not as vision or allegory, but as a letter, a message from Enoch to his son Methuselah, and through him to all future generations. A warning about what's coming, about the division of time into 10 weeks, 7 of which have already passed, and the final 3, the ones that speak of exposure and judgment and renewal. Those weeks may be unfolding right now, in our world, in our time. This is the Epistle of Enoch, and it's not gentle. It's not comforting.
It reads like a final warning from someone who has seen the end and is desperate to make sure we understand what's at stake, what's required, what will happen to those who ignore the warning. And as we turn to this final section, as we read the words Enoch left for those who would come after, the question we have to ask is whether we're willing to hear them, whether we're ready to face what they reveal about where we are in the timeline, about how close we might be to the opening of the books. Chapter 7. The Epistle. The Final Weeks. You're holding a letter now, ancient beyond measure, the parchment thin and delicate, as if it might crumble at your touch. And the words written on it are not addressed to you specifically, but they feel personal anyway, urgent, as if the writer knew that someone in your time, in your world, would need to read them, would need to understand what they contain. This is the Epistle of Enoch, the final section of the book, chapters 91 through 108. And unlike the visions and allegories that came before, this is direct, almost conversational. A father writing to his son Methuselah, sharing wisdom, issuing warnings, trying to compress everything he's learned into words that will survive him, that will guide those who come after when he's no longer there to teach them. The letter begins with instructions about righteousness, about how to live, what to value, what to avoid. And you might expect this to feel dated, irrelevant, the moral concerns of a man who lived before the flood, translated through centuries of copying and translation until they're barely recognizable. But instead, the words feel immediate, contemporary, as if the struggles Enoch describes, the temptations toward greed and violence and compromise, are the same struggles every generation faces, as if human nature hasn't changed much in the thousands of years since these words were written, as if the letter was written not for one son in one moment, but for all sons, all daughters, all people who would ever face the choice between righteousness and corruption, between following the pattern of the white bull or succumbing to the way of the predators. But then the tone shifts about halfway through the epistle, and Enoch begins to speak not about how to live, but about when, about time itself, about the structure of history, and he introduces a concept that scholars call the apocalypse of weeks, a division of all human history from creation to final judgment into 10 symbolic periods, 10 weeks, though these are not weeks of 7 days, but weeks of generations, of eras, of ages. And as Enoch describes them, as he moves through the first 7 weeks, which from his perspective are past and present, you realize that several of these descriptions align with actual historical events, with the destruction of the temple, with the exile, with the corruption of religious leadership. And the accuracy is unsettling, disturbing even, because it suggests that either the author of this section had access to remarkable historical knowledge and was retelling it in prophetic form, or the vision was real. The division of time into weeks was revealed, and Enoch, or whoever wrote in his name, really did see the pattern, really did understand how history would unfold. And then come the final 3 weeks, the 8th, 9th, and 10th, and these are different. These are future from every perspective. They describe events that have not yet happened, or are happening now, or are about to happen, depending on how you interpret the symbols. And as you read them, as you trace Enoch's words describing the exposure of wickedness, the fall of corrupt powers, the opening of the books, the final judgment, you feel a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature of the room, because these descriptions sound familiar. They sound like the world you're living in, like the patterns you see playing out in your own time. And the question that rises unbidden, the question you cannot suppress, is, what week are we in? How close are we to the end? And if the pattern Enoch saw is accurate, what comes next? The apocalypse of weeks divides history into 10 periods, each one called a week, and the structure is deliberate. 7 weeks representing completion, perfection, the fulfillment of a cycle, and then 3 additional weeks representing the final act, the denouement, the resolution of everything that came before.
and Enoch describes each week in terms of what will happen, what the dominant characteristic of that period will be. And while the language is symbolic, compressed, open to interpretation, there are enough specific details that scholars have been able to map most of the first 7 weeks onto actual historical periods with reasonable confidence. The first week is described as the time of Enoch himself, the period of early humanity when righteousness still existed, when men like Enoch could walk with God. And this week ends with Enoch being taken, removed from the world before the corruption becomes complete. The second week is the time of Noah, the week of the great deluge, when the earth is cleansed and a remnant preserved. And Enoch says that a man will be saved, and after him a plant of righteousness will be established, which clearly refers to Noah and the covenant God makes with him after the flood. The third week describes the choosing of Abraham, the establishment of the covenant with Israel, the promise that through his seed all nations will be blessed. And Enoch says that in this week a man will be chosen as the plant of righteous judgment, and his descendants will become the plant of righteousness forever. The fourth week describes the giving of the law, Moses on Sinai receiving the commandments, the establishment of the temple, the glory of God dwelling among his people. And Enoch says that in this week holy and righteous ones will receive visions, and a law for all generations will be established. The fifth week describes the corruption of the temple system, the division of the kingdom, the decline into idolatry and injustice. And Enoch says that in this week a house of glory and dominion will be built, which probably refers to Solomon's temple, but he also hints at the corruption that will follow. The way the very structures meant to honor God will become tools of oppression. The sixth week describes increasing wickedness, blindness, hardness of heart, and it ends with destruction, with the burning of the house, which scholars universally interpret as the destruction of Solomon's temple by Babylon in 586 BC. And Enoch says that in this week all who dwell in it will be dispersed, which matches the Babylonian exile perfectly. The seventh week is where things get controversial, because Enoch describes this as a week of apostasy, of perverse generations, of corrupt leadership, and he says that at the end of this week the righteous will be chosen, given sevenfold wisdom and knowledge, and they will root out the foundations of violence and the structure of falsehood to execute judgment. And many scholars believe this refers to the Maccabean period, the 2nd century BC, when Jewish rebels rose up against Greek oppression, purified the temple, and established a period of independence. And if that's correct, if the seventh week ends around 160 BC with the Maccabean victory, then the text was written during or shortly after the events it describes, which means it's prophecy only in the sense that it's framing recent history as the fulfillment of an ancient vision. But then we reach the 8th week, and everything changes, because from this point forward, the events described have not clearly happened, or are happening now, or are about to happen, depending on your interpretation. And Enoch says that in the 8th week, the righteous will acquire houses through righteousness, and a temple of the kingdom of the Great One will be built in glory forevermore. And some interpreters see this as referring to the second temple, the one built after the exile, which would place the 8th week in the Persian period. But others point out that Enoch says this temple will be built in glory forevermore. And the second temple was destroyed by Rome in 70 AD, so perhaps the 8th week refers to something else, a spiritual temple, the church, the community of believers who carry the presence of God without needing a physical building. Or perhaps it refers to a temple that has not yet been built, the one that will be established when the Messiah returns. The 9th week is even more cryptic. Enoch says that in this week, righteous judgment will be revealed to the whole world, and the deeds of the wicked will vanish from the earth, and the world will be written down for destruction, which sounds apocalyptic, final, like the beginning of the end. And some interpreters believe we're living in the 9th week now, that the exposure of corruption we're witnessing, the way secrets are being revealed, systems are being challenged, the powerful are being held accountable in ways they never were before. That this is the fulfillment of Enoch's prophecy. That we're in the week when righteous judgment is being revealed and the world is being written down for destruction, which doesn't mean physical annihilation, but marking, designating, separating the wheat from the chaff in preparation for what comes next. And then the 10th week, the final week, and Enoch describes this in 2 phases. He says that in the 7th part of the 10th week, which suggests that weeks can be subdivided just as the larger timeline is divided, there will be a great eternal judgment executed on the watchers. The fallen angels will receive their final sentence, and after this judgment, a new heaven will appear, and the old heaven will pass away, and the heavenly luminaries will shine 7-fold brighter, and there will be many weeks without number, stretching into eternity. And during these endless weeks, there will be no more sin, only goodness and righteousness forever. And this is clearly describing the new creation, the restoration of all things, the final state where heaven and earth are reunited, where death and pain and corruption no longer exist, where the pattern that began with Adam's fall is finally and completely reversed. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, where the text stops being an interesting historical curiosity and becomes a challenge, a question. Because if the 7th week ended around 160 BC, and if the events Enoch describes for weeks 8 through 10 have not yet fully happened, then we're somewhere in that final sequence. We're living in the end times, the last weeks of the apocalypse. And the things happening in our world, the exposure of corruption, the challenges to entrenched power, the sense that systems are breaking down and something new is trying to emerge. These are not random. They're not accidents. They're part of the pattern. They're what Enoch saw when he looked forward through time and described the 9th and 10th weeks. And if that's true, if we're really in this period, then what comes next is not more of the same, not just another cycle of rise and fall, but the final act, the judgment, the separation, the opening of the books. And the question each of us has to answer is what side we'll be on when that happens. The epistle doesn't just describe the weeks, it also contains moral exhortations, warnings to the wicked, and encouragement to the righteous. And these sections are blunt, uncompromising. Enoch speaks of the rich who oppress the poor, who gain wealth through injustice, who trust in their treasures and ignore the suffering around them. And he promises that their wealth will not save them, that on the day of judgment their riches will testify against them, that they will be thrown into the flame along with their gold and silver. And this is not metaphor, not allegory. Enoch is saying that wealth gained through oppression is evidence of guilt, that economic injustice is spiritual corruption, and those who participate in it will face consequences. And this message, this direct challenge to the wealthy and powerful, is probably another reason the book was eventually removed from circulation. Because Christianity, as it gained power and wealth, became uncomfortable with texts that condemned wealth and power so directly. But the epistle also offers hope. It speaks to those who suffer, who are oppressed, who live in poverty not because of their own failures, but because they've been exploited by others. And Enoch tells them to endure, to remain righteous, to trust that their suffering is seen, recorded, that justice is coming, that the books are being kept. And on the day of judgment, they will be vindicated. Their oppressors will be condemned, and they will inherit the new creation, the endless weeks of righteousness and peace. And this hope is not cheap. It's not denial of suffering or pretending that injustice doesn't matter. It's the deep hope that comes from believing that the universe is moral, that there is a pattern, that corruption is not the final word, and that the Lord of the sheep will descend, set up his throne, open the books, and make all things right. What the Apocalypse of Weeks offers, what it's been offering since it was written, is a map through time, a way of understanding where we are in the larger story. And that's a profound gift, because one of the most disorienting aspects of living through historical change is not knowing what it means, not knowing if the chaos you're experiencing is temporary or terminal, not knowing if you're in the middle of a cycle or at the end of one.
And Enoch says, you can know. You can look at the characteristics of each week, compare them to your own time, and figure out where you are. And if you're honest about what you see, if you're willing to admit that the exposure of wickedness, the challenge to corrupt powers, the sense that old structures are crumbling, if you admit that these match the description of the 9th week, then you also have to admit what comes next. The 10th week, the judgment, the new creation. And that changes everything. It changes how you live, what you value, what you're willing to sacrifice. Because if we're really in the final weeks, if the pattern Enoch saw is accurate, and we're approaching the moment when the books are opened, then the choices we make now matter in ways they never did before. There's no more time to wait, no more room to compromise, no more luxury of neutrality. You're either with the righteous or with the wicked. You're either one of the sheep or one of the predators, or one of the corrupt shepherds. And when the Lord descends and sets up his throne, your position will be revealed, not based on what you claim to believe, but on what you actually did, how you treated the vulnerable, whether you used power to protect or to exploit, whether you told the truth or participated in the structure of falsehood. And this is terrifying. The idea that we're being sorted, evaluated, recorded, that every action has eternal consequences, that there's no escape through death or time or forgetting. But it's also clarifying, because if you really believe this, if you take Enoch seriously, then a lot of the things that seem important, that dominate our attention, that we spend our lives pursuing, suddenly reveal themselves as distractions, as irrelevant to the only question that matters, which is, what will be written about you in the books when they're opened? What testimony will be given? What evidence will be presented? And the answer to that question is being determined now by how you live, what you choose, whose side you're on. But there's also comfort here, for those who suffer, who struggle, who try to do right in a world that rewards wrong. Because the Epistle promises that your suffering is not forgotten, your righteousness is recorded. And when the judgment comes, when the wicked are thrown into the pit, and the white bull appears, and all the animals are transformed, you will be among those vindicated, among those who inherit the new creation, the endless weeks of peace. So where does this leave us, standing here at the end of Enoch's testimony, having walked with him through the rebellion of the Watchers, the birth of the Nephilim, the judgment of the flood, the visions of the Son of Man, the secrets of the heavens, the allegory of history, and finally this letter, this urgent epistle warning us about the final weeks? Where does this leave you, reader, listener, person sitting in the glow of your screen, wondering if any of this is true, if it matters, if you should take it seriously or dismiss it as ancient mythology? The answer, the only honest answer, is that you have to decide. You have to look at the world around you, at the patterns playing out, at the exposure and the corruption, and the sense that something is ending and something else is trying to be born. And you have to ask yourself if this matches what Enoch described, if we're living in the 9th week, if the judgment is approaching. And if you decide that we are, if you look at the evidence and conclude that the pattern is real, that the apocalypse of weeks is not ancient fantasy, but accurate prophecy, then you have to ask the harder question. What does that mean for how you live? What changes? What becomes urgent? What becomes irrelevant? Because the epistle is clear. The time for neutrality is over. The books are being written, and every choice you make is being recorded. And when the Lord of the sheep descends,
When the throne is set up and the judgment begins, what's written about you will determine where you stand, with the vindicated or with the condemned. The letter ends not with certainty, but with invitation, not with answers, but with challenge. And as you set it down, as the vision fades and you return to your ordinary world, the words follow you, the warning echoes, and the question remains, what week are we in? How close is the judgment? And when the books are opened, what will they say about you? You've walked a long path with me tonight, through mountains and deserts and throne rooms, through visions that span from the beginning of creation to the end of all things. And now, as we stand together at the close of this journey, I want to answer the question that's been hanging in the air since the beginning, the question that matters more than any other. Why was the Book of Enoch banned? Why did councils in the 4th and 5th centuries decide that this text, quoted by apostles, revered by early Christians, copied and studied across the ancient world, why did they decide it had to go? And the answer, I think, is not what most people assume. It wasn't banned because it was false. Scholarship has shown that parts of it are older than many books in the Bible. Fragments found in the Dead Sea Scrolls prove it was read and respected in the centuries before Christ, and early church fathers quoted it as authoritative. So the problem wasn't authenticity, and it wasn't banned because it contradicted Scripture. In fact, it explains Scripture. It fills in the gaps that Genesis leaves open. It makes explicit what the prophets only hinted at. It provides the backstory for spiritual warfare, for the origin of demons, for the reason God sent the flood. So the problem wasn't theology, at least not in the way we usually think of theological problems. The Book of Enoch was banned, I believe, because it was too direct, too clear, too uncomfortable for institutions that were beginning to consolidate power. Because Enoch's story says that you don't need a temple to walk with God. You don't need priests to mediate. You don't need an institution to give you permission to have a relationship with the divine. You just walk. You keep walking, day after day, year after year, and if you do that long enough, God takes you. God shows you secrets. God brings you into the heavenly realms. And that kind of unmediated access is dangerous to hierarchies, to systems built on control, to religious structures that depend on being gatekeepers between humanity and the holy. And the Book of Enoch was banned because it makes judgment central, not peripheral. It says that the Son of Man is coming not just to teach or to heal, but to judge, to open books, to separate sheep from goats, to throw the wicked into fire and vindicate the oppressed. And that's a dangerous message when Christianity is becoming the religion of emperors, when the church is aligning itself with political power, when the people who would be judged are the same people funding cathedrals and councils. Because if the Messiah's primary role is to challenge the powerful, to expose corruption, to strip authority from those who abuse it, then the church should be doing the same. And that's not a message that serves institutional survival. And the Book of Enoch was banned because it suggests that history is not random, that there's a pattern, a structure, a divine timeline unfolding, and we're not at the beginning of that timeline. We're near the end, in the 9th week perhaps, or the 10th. And if that's true, then the chaos we see, the exposure of secrets, the crumbling of systems, these are not signs that the world is falling apart. They're signs that the pattern is completing, that judgment is approaching. And institutions prefer narratives they can control. They prefer to tell you that things will continue as they always have, that the arc of history is long and progress is steady, and there's no urgency, no reckoning, just slow incremental change. But Enoch says no, there's an end. It's written. It's coming. And when it arrives, everything changes. But here's what they couldn't erase. Here's what survived despite the councils and the condemnations and the 1,000 years of silence. The truth that the Book of Enoch carries is not dependent on whether it's in the Bible. Truth doesn't need institutional approval. It doesn't require a stamp of orthodoxy. It persists. It survives. It finds a way. And the fact that this text endured in Ethiopia while the rest of the Christian world forgot it, the fact that it resurfaced in 1773, just when the Enlightenment was teaching people to question authority and seek knowledge for themselves, the fact that you're hearing about it now, in this moment, in your time, that's not accident. That's pattern. That's the way truth works. It waits, it hides, and then it returns when it's needed most. So what do you do with this? What do you do with the knowledge that there was a book, is a book, that tells a different story than the one you were taught, that says angels fell and giants walked and demons are real and judgment is coming and history is not random but structured, moving through weeks toward a conclusion that was seen and recorded thousands of years ago? You could dismiss it, call it mythology, ancient speculation, interesting but irrelevant, and go back to your life unchanged. Or you could sit with it. Let it unsettle you. Let it ask you questions you don't have easy answers for. Questions like, what if the pattern is real? What if we're in the final weeks? What if the books are being written and every choice I make is being recorded? What then? How do I live? What matters? Whose side am I on? I don't know what week we're in. I don't know if the judgment Enoch described is coming tomorrow or 1,000 years from now. I don't know if the Son of Man will appear in our lifetime, or if we're still waiting, still hoping,
still enduring in the time between promise and fulfillment. But I know this. The Book of Enoch has survived because its message is timeless. Because every generation faces the same choice Enoch faced, between walking with God or walking away, between righteousness and corruption, between being a sheep or a predator, or a shepherd who fails. And every generation needs to hear that the choice matters, that it's being recorded, that justice delayed is not justice denied, that the books are being kept and accounts will be settled. And I know this too. You're not here by accident. You didn't stumble onto this story randomly. Something in you was searching, questioning, sensing that the narrative you've been given is incomplete. And you found your way here, to this manuscript that was banned and buried and nearly lost. And maybe that's because you're meant to be part of the uncovering, part of the return, part of the generation that asks the questions history tried to silence and refuses to accept easy answers. And if that's true, if you're really here for a reason, then the question Enoch's story asks you is simple and terrible and unavoidable. When the books are opened, when your life is laid bare, when every choice and every word and every moment of courage or cowardice is revealed, what will the record show? Will it show someone who walked, who kept walking, who chose righteousness even when it cost something? Or will it show someone who knew the truth and did nothing, who saw the pattern and ignored it, who had the chance to stand with the oppressed and chose comfort instead? The Book of Enoch ends not with certainty, but with hope. The hope that corruption is not forever, that the white bull is coming, that the new creation is real, that the endless weeks of peace are not fantasy but future, not dream but destiny, and that hope is available to you, right now, tonight, no matter what you've done or failed to do, because the books are still being written.
The final week has not yet ended. There's still time to choose, still time to walk, still time to be counted among the righteous when the judgment comes. So sleep well, knowing that you've heard something true, something old, something that survived against all odds because it needed to reach you. And when you wake, remember that the pattern is still unfolding, that you're part of the story, that your choices matter, and that somewhere, in the architecture of creation, in the throne room of heaven, in the books that will one day be opened, your name is written, and what's written beside it is still being determined. By how you live, by what you choose, by whose side you stand on, And the invitation Enoch extends across millennia is this: walk. Keep walking, and see where the path leads. Because those who walk with God long enough eventually find themselves taken, lifted, shown secrets, and made part of something far greater than they ever imagined possible. The manuscript closes now, the lamplight dims, and the journey ends where it began, with a question, with an invitation, with the sense that something ancient and true has touched your life. And what you do with that, how you respond, whether you walk forward or turn back, that's up to you. But know this: the pattern remembers, the books are watching, and when the final week comes, when the Son of Man sits on his throne and the judgment begins, every choice you made in the time between hearing and seeing will matter, will count, will be revealed. So choose well, walk bravely, and may you find yourself, when all is said and done, among the sheep, among the righteous, among those who endured and believed and walked even when the path was dark, because the dawn is coming, the white bull is coming, and the new creation that Enoch saw is closer than you think.